What if every object in this tomb was more than just treasure? A spoon, shaped like a goddess. A game board that taught the soul how to survive. A crown that whispered of life after death. These weren't tools. They were messages left behind for eternity. Still watching? Then you're exactly the kind of explorer this channel was made for. Hit subscribe and keep digging deeper. The table that prepared the dead. Mummification bench. In a dim chamber lit only by flickering torchlight, a body was laid gently onto a flat stone surface. This wasn't a bed, it wasn't a tomb, and it wasn't quite an altar. This was the beginning of a transformation. A transformation that, to the ancient Egyptians, meant far more than death. This was the mummification bench. It may seem like just a stone table, cold, still, silent, but to the Egyptians, this bench wasn't merely functional, it was sacred. Every time a body was placed upon it, they believed a journey was beginning, not just into death, but into the afterlife, into eternity, and everything had to be done exactly right. Let's step back for a moment. Imagine yourself standing in that chamber. It's quiet, so quiet you can hear your own breath. The walls are covered with symbols, spells, and scenes of gods who oversee death. Incantations, rituals, warnings. A priest enters, calm and precise. The body before him has already been washed and ritually purified. The soul, they believe, is still nearby, watching. The table, this mummification bench, was carved to a specific height. Not too low, not too tall. Just right for the embalmer to carry out his work without error. Its surface was smooth, but slanted ever so slightly, allowing fluids to drain away during the process. Underneath, a basin was often carved to catch what flowed from the body. Not a detail was overlooked. This wasn't crude science, it was guided by thousands of years of spiritual belief. At this bench, some of the most intricate and unsettling rituals in Egyptian history took place. The body was carefully opened, the stomach, the intestines, the liver, each removed and placed in canopic jars, sealed with the heads of protective gods. But it wasn't just about removing organs, it was about preserving the essence of the person, keeping their identity intact. The heart, sometimes it was left in, sometimes it was taken out, and sometimes something went wrong. Sometimes the heart was removed and never returned. Without it, the soul was believed to be lost in the afterlife, unable to face judgment. What happened in those cases, we still don't fully understand. Were those people cursed, punished, forgotten? Then came the brain, removed through the nose with a hooked tool, a process so bizarre and specific that even modern medicine finds it impressive. But to the Egyptians, the brain had little importance. The heart was where thoughts came from, where emotion lived. The brain, it was waste. On this table, the body would then be packed with natron, a kind of natural salt, drying it for weeks, sometimes even for 70 days. Every few days priests returned, checked the progress, whispered prayers. The smell of resin and incense filled the chamber, a sacred scent, one that the soul could follow, like a beacon back to its body. After drying, the body was reshaped, the skin oiled, the limbs carefully wrapped with linen, fingers, toes, even individual joints received attention. The embalmers knew what they were doing. This was a spiritual science passed down through generations, and all of it happened on that table. Some mummification benches were simple, others were carved with spells from the Book of the Dead. Some were portable, others fixed in underground chambers, deep in the tombs of nobles and kings. But all of them carried the same weight, the same purpose, to preserve a soul, to guide it safely into the afterlife. And here's where it gets stranger. We found mummification benches far from the Nile, in deserts, in remote burial pits, some with strange burn marks, others with tools laid across them, as if the work had been interrupted and never resumed. Why were these benches abandoned mid-ritual? What forced the embalmers to leave? One bench, discovered near Luxor, still held the body of a child, unfinished. The linen was only half wrapped. The natron was spilled onto the floor. The canopic jars were untouched. Something happened there, something sudden, and to this day, we have no record of who the child was, or why the burial was never completed. The room was sealed, as if in haste. Another bench, found deep beneath Saqqara, was made not of stone, but of gold-laced wood, carved with symbols of protection. On its edge was a tiny inscription, so small it was missed for years. It reads, "Here the gods watched." What does that mean? Was it symbolic, or did the embalmers believe they were being observed by the divine as they worked? And what about the tools, the blades, the hooks, the scoops? Some of them were made with metals we still don't fully recognize, combinations that suggest knowledge of chemistry far beyond what we thought the Egyptians knew. Could it be that some aspects of the mummification process were more advanced than we've given them credit for? Some scholars believe the bench itself was more than a table, that it symbolized the threshold between worlds, that once the body touched its surface, it was no longer truly of this world. It had begun its journey. The embalmers weren't just preserving, they were transforming, turning flesh into a vessel for eternity. And it wasn't only humans. Animals too were mummified. Cats, crocodiles, ibises, each laid on its own smaller version of the mummification bench. Some animal mummies were offerings, others were sacred pets. A few were believed to be living manifestations of gods. Even in death, they held power. Modern archaeologists have tried to recreate the process, some using ancient texts, others working from physical evidence. But something always feels incomplete, as if we're missing an ingredient, a step, a prayer, something that can't be seen with science alone. And maybe that's the point. The mummification bench wasn't just a tool, it was a sacred threshold, a place where the known ended and the unknown began. A place where every cut, every wrap of linen, every drop of resin was part of a ritual that reached beyond time. Even today, when we uncover one of these benches, we step into something older than history. We walk into a room where breath once stopped and eternity began. The jar that held souls, canopic vessel lore. Long before our modern world learned to preserve memories in photographs or encrypt them in data, the ancient Egyptians believed that something far more vital needed protection, the very essence of the soul itself. In a silent, shadowed chamber beneath the desert sands, surrounded by walls etched with divine symbols and prayers to the afterlife, rested 4 jars, not made of gold, but of alabaster, limestone, or sometimes clay. Modest in size, elegant in design, and yet sacred beyond measure. These were the canopic jars, vessels not for food, not for water, but for something that most would never dare to handle. They held the organs of the dead, but to say they were just storage containers would miss the point entirely. These jars weren't crafted by potters alone. Their creation involved priests, incantations, ritual purifications, and a deep understanding of the afterlife, so central to the Egyptian worldview that even death became a carefully orchestrated journey, not a final destination. So what made these jars so important? Why not simply bury the body whole? Why go through the trouble of removing the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines, and placing them into separate inscribed containers? To answer that, we have to leave behind the rational lens of modern science and walk into a mindset that saw the body not as a machine, but as a vessel of divine balance, spiritual fragments, and eternal rebirth. The Egyptians believed the human being was composed of multiple spiritual elements, Ka, Ba, Ren, and Shut, all of which had specific roles and destinies after death. The physical body, though destined to decay, was still necessary to anchor these parts and ensure rebirth into the next world. Preservation wasn't just a ritual, it was a spiritual necessity. And each organ, according to tradition, had a symbolic tie to one of the 4 sons of Horus, divine guardians appointed to protect the soul's journey through the Duat, the underworld. Each canopic jar bore a lid carved in the likeness of these guardians: Imseti, the human-headed protector of the liver; Hapi, the baboon-headed guardian of the lungs; Duamutef, jackal-headed, watching over the stomach; and Kebisanuef, falcon-headed, keeper of the intestines. But it wasn't just about protection. Each guardian was associated with a direction: north, south, east, west, with a goddess, with a cosmic role in the afterlife. The jars were placed carefully inside canopic chests, sometimes buried within intricately carved shrines, always near the mummy. Their positioning had meaning. Their inscriptions had power. Some jars even carried specific spells, chapter 151 of the Book of the Dead, for example, that invoked protection, purification, and safe passage through the perils of the afterlife. And here's where it becomes truly fascinating. In some tombs, archaeologists found canopic jars with no organs inside, empty but still honored. Why? Was it a symbolic act? Was the ritual more important than the physical contents? Or did these elite Egyptians find new ways to preserve the soul? Even more mysterious are cases where organs were returned to the body after embalming, a reversal of the norm, a deviation from one of Egypt's most sacred traditions. Did something change in their beliefs over time? Perhaps. There's another layer to this story that's rarely told, one that's less about ritual and more about protection, on a cosmic level. The jars weren't just physical containers, they were magical boundaries, keeping chaos at bay. Each organ, if left within the body, was believed to attract decomposition, corruption, and even spiritual sabotage from dark forces of the Duat. Removing them wasn't just hygienic, it was metaphysical defense. And when a priest sealed a canopic jar, he wasn't just placing a lid, he was locking away vulnerability, securing harmony, protecting the Kav and Ba for their long voyage through the underworld. You see, the Egyptians didn't fear death the way we do today. They prepared for it, practiced for it, honored it. In temples, Scribes would record burial rituals with near mathematical precision. The placement of amulets, the direction of the tomb, the length of the linen bandages, and of course the preparation of the canopic jars. Each decision mattered, and when we walk into tombs today, tombs of queens like Tae, or pharaohs like Tutankhamun, we still find these jars in place, sometimes shattered, sometimes intact, but always close to where the body once lay. A reminder that even in death, the Egyptians never let go of the importance of protection, purification, and balance. Tutankhamun's tomb revealed a stunning canopic chest, gilded, decorated with lapis lazuli, obsidian, and carnelian, housing jars made of calcite. They were sculpted to resemble the boy king himself, tenderly, with care. Each organ wrapped in linen, anointed in oils, and placed within. Why so much effort? Because to the Egyptians, rebirth wasn't just a hope, it was a promise, one that could only be fulfilled if the right steps were followed. Even the jars themselves, simple as they may appear today, were once whispered over by priests, blessed with incense, and guarded by spells. It's a humbling thing to consider, that thousands of years ago humans stood in the flickering light of oil lamps, whispering prayers over stone jars, not for riches, not for glory, but for the safety of a soul, and that even now, after so many centuries, we can still read their symbols, translate their intentions, and feel their reverence echo through time. The canopic jars are more than relics, they're messages from a world that believed the soul had weight, that the body had memory, and that death wasn't the end, but only a door. And tonight, as we drift off to sleep, maybe there's something oddly comforting in that thought, that even long ago, someone took the time to protect what mattered most, not with walls, not with weapons, but with faith, and with jars. The brush that wrote eternity. Reed pen and ink palette. In the long corridor of Egyptian legacy, among colossal monuments and golden masks, it's easy to overlook something far humbler, something delicate, quiet, and yet more powerful than stone. Not a pharaoh's crown, not a mummy's bandages, but a reed, a sharpened reed, dipped in dark, carbon-based ink, dragged across papyrus, line by line, word by word, a voice given permanence, not through thunderous architecture, but through ink. This is the story of the Egyptian reed pen and the ink palette, a set of tools so simple, yet they carried the weight of eternity. If the pyramids were the voice of Egypt's power, the reed pen was the voice of its memory, its ideas, its rules, its gods, its fears. Let's begin in a quiet room, not a grand temple, not a battlefield, a scribe's chamber. Light filters in through a high, narrow window. The air is dry and cool, and at the center, a man sits cross-legged, focused. Before him lies a flat wooden palette, grooved with tiny recesses that hold red and black pigments. His left hand steadies the papyrus. His right holds a reed, its tip chewed to a soft brush. He dips. He writes. He dips again. In this moment, he is not just recording laws or rituals. He is ensuring that a civilization, thousands of years old, will never be forgotten. The reed pen was made from Juncus maritimus, a marsh plant found along the Nile. When sliced diagonally and frayed just enough, it could carry ink with surprising precision. Egyptians didn't use bound books. They used papyrus scrolls, flattened, dried, pressed reeds glued together, side by side, lightweight, portable, and long-lasting in Egypt's arid climate. But what gave it life wasn't the paper, it was what went on it, and for that, scribes relied on ink made from soot, water, and plant-based gum, sometimes red ink, often black. Red for headings, warnings, or the names of dangerous gods, black for body text, the stuff of contracts, stories, and prayers. Now consider what these scribes were recording. The Book of the Dead, filled with spells to help the soul navigate the afterlife. Government records that told who owned what and how much grain was owed. Hymns to the gods, medical texts, legal codes, family disputes, even love letters. The palette, while simple, was often beautifully made. Some had slots to hold more than one pen. Others bore the names of their owners, often carved in hieroglyphs. One example found in a tomb near Thebes was so well preserved that ink still remained in its wells, untouched for over 3,000 years. But beyond the materials and design, it's the role of the scribe that reveals why these tools mattered so much. Scribes were among the most respected members of Egyptian society, not quite royalty, but far above farmers or laborers. They had the rare ability to read and write, skills that granted them power, mobility, and often wealth. To be a scribe was to be close to pharaohs, priests, and the divine. And unlike warriors or builders, scribes left behind not just physical work, but thought. They recorded how the world was understood, who ruled and why, how to speak to the gods, what a proper burial looked like. Without them, Egypt's past might have vanished. No Rosetta Stone, no medical papyri, no names like Ramses or Akhenaten. There's something almost paradoxical about it. The might of Egypt, so often associated with gold and granite, ultimately depended on reeds and soot, fragile things, organic, degradable, and yet some of the oldest written documents on Earth survive today because of that simplicity. When archaeologists found unopened scrolls in desert tombs, they weren't just discovering writing, they were unrolling memory, unsealing centuries. They were reading words that hadn't been seen by human eyes in over 30 generations. In museums today, you'll find reed pens and palettes displayed behind glass, sometimes overlooked by visitors in search of more dramatic objects. But to scholars and historians, these were Egypt's truest time machines. They held language, identity, ritual, myth. They taught us how the ancients lived, loved, fought, and mourned. And unlike statues or tombs, these objects weren't made to impress. They were made to function. They weren't designed for eternity, and yet they achieved it anyway. There is something beautifully human in that, in the idea that history could be preserved, not by kings or monuments, but by careful hands, repetitive motion, and daily routine. Scribes didn't work with crowds cheering them on. They sat alone, surrounded by silence, carving words into time itself. The reed pen didn't roar. It whispered. It murmured from scroll to scroll, generation to generation. It carried the thoughts of gods and farmers alike, and even now, thousands of years later, we're still listening. So when you see a tiny ink palette, or a worn-down reed behind museum glass, know that you're looking at something far greater than its appearance. You're looking at the very reason we know Egypt at all. You're looking at a brush that wrote eternity. The mirror that saw the afterlife. There is something hauntingly beautiful about ancient mirrors. Not the kind we know today, cold, silver-backed glass framed in metal, but something far older, far more sacred. In ancient Egypt, mirrors were more than tools for reflection. They were portals, quiet, polished bronze circles, believed to show not just the face, but the soul. Tonight, we're tracing the story of a single object, the bronze mirror, often nestled deep in tombs, resting beside linen wrappings and jars of oils. At first glance, it seems simple. A handle, a disc, no decoration, no jewels. But for the Egyptians, this mirror was not vanity. It was ritual, memory, power. Let's begin, slowly. Imagine you're inside the dim interior of an old kingdom tomb. The torchlight flickers against painted limestone walls. In a corner lies a flat, round object, darkened by time, smooth, even now. A bronze mirror, laid gently beside the body it once served. Who held it last? Who looked into its surface, hoping not just to see themselves, but something more? Egyptians believed in the power of symbols, and a mirror was never just for seeing. It was for reaching across realms. In the Book of the Dead, we find spells describing how the soul must recognize itself in the afterlife. It must remember its own form, its name, its voice, and so, mirrors were placed with the dead. To aid that memory, to anchor the soul. The mirror's round shape mirrored the sun itself, smooth, endless, eternal. To gaze into it was to look at Ra, the god of creation, the god of rebirth. Some scholars believe that the act of looking into a mirror during life was more than habit. It was preparation, a way of practicing for what came after. Now, let's slow it down, breathe in, and picture a woman in Thebes, around 1450 BCE. She's seated on a low stool, brushing perfumed oil into her hair. Her hand reaches for a polished bronze mirror. She tilts it, not just to check her appearance, but to whisper a quiet offering to Hathor, goddess of beauty, joy, and the afterlife. For her, this mirror is sacred. When she dies, it will follow her into the tomb. Archaeologists have found these objects again and again, in royal burials, in tombs of priestesses, even in the hands of the embalmed, fingers curled around them as if refusing to let go. The earliest mirrors in Egypt appeared in the pre-dynastic period, over 5,000 years ago. Made from copper or bronze, they had to be polished daily with sand and oil. The process took time and intention. This wasn't convenience, it was ritual. Even the handle mattered. Some were carved like lotus stems, a symbol of rebirth. Others took the form of deities, especially Hathor, who often appeared with cow ears and a serene smile, her arms cradling the reflective disc. Why such care for an object so ordinary? Because for Egyptians, the line between the seen and the unseen was thin. What we call ordinary, they considered symbolic. Now, let's drift a bit. Think of a mirror in complete darkness. There's no reflection, no light, but the mirror still holds the possibility of an image. The Egyptians believed that potential, that silence was sacred. When placed in tombs, mirrors weren't just buried, they were activated. Spell 44 of the Book of the Dead reads, "I shall see Ra in the morning. I shall look upon his face in my mirror, and I shall not be blinded." This wasn't metaphor, They believed they would use the mirror to see the gods. Some tombs held multiple mirrors, each buried facing east, toward the rising sun, placed with intention, meant to catch the very first light of dawn. It's subtle, isn't it? But in that moment, the mirror becomes a sunrise, a resurrection, a path home. There's another layer to this. Bronze. Over time, oxidizes. It darkens, becomes cloudy. But the Egyptians didn't see this as decay. They saw it as transformation. Just as the body changed in death, so too would the mirror. Its reflection would become less about physical form and more about memory, spirit, energy. Some Egyptologists theorize that these mirrors weren't used just to reflect, but to receive messages, symbols, dreams. Priestesses may have used them in ceremonies, holding them to the sky during festivals, hoping to catch divine signs, not unlike how seers used crystal balls centuries later. Let that image rest in your mind. The silence of a temple courtyard. A hand lifting a bronze disc to the heavens, waiting, watching, not for vanity, but for meaning. Now, let's return to the tomb. In 1923, when Howard Carter opened the tomb of Tutankhamun, he found several mirrors, each carefully stored among perfumes, linen and ivory combs. Some were inlaid with gold, others were simple bronze, but all were placed with care, angled as if still waiting for use. Tutankhamun was only a boy when he died, but his mirrors suggest a belief that even children must face the afterlife with full sight. And it makes you wonder, what did he see as he passed into that realm? Did he look into that mirror one last time, or perhaps the mirror looked into him? Some legends say that mirrors remember, that the surface holds shadows of every face it has ever seen. And in a place like Egypt, where memory was sacred, that idea wasn't fantasy, it was truth. To hold a mirror was to hold a piece of time. So next time you look into a mirror, any mirror, pause. Imagine it showing not just your face, but your past lives, your future paths, your buried memories, because in ancient Egypt, that's exactly what they believed. And that belief still echoes, still waits, still shines. Even after thousands of years, in the silence of stone tombs and desert winds, the mirror remains. The game that trained the mind. Senate board. In the still hush of ancient Egyptian homes, long before the sun set behind sandstone cliffs, a different kind of ritual often unfolded, not with incense or chants, but with quiet, strategic movement. Two players, usually seated on smooth stone benches or wooden stools, would lean over a polished board marked with a curious pattern of squares. Their fingers hovered over small carved pieces, worn smooth by centuries of handling. This was Senate, the game of passing. But Senate was never just a game. To the modern eye, it may look like nothing more than a simple board game, perhaps even a distraction for idle hands. But to the people of ancient Egypt, Senate was a symbolic journey, a spiritual path, a metaphor for life, death, and what lay beyond. It was a game that demanded thought and patience, yet whispered of the soul's eternal passage. And curiously, despite being found in the tombs of pharaohs, it was once played by commoners, nobles, and scribes alike. Its origin? That part is murky. No exact record tells us who first etched those rows of squares onto wood or stone, but evidence dates it back over 5,000 years, making it one of the oldest known board games on Earth. Early depictions of Senate appear in the tombs of the 5th dynasty. By the time of the New Kingdom, the game had evolved far beyond mere entertainment. It had acquired religious meaning. It was said that to win at Senate meant the soul had navigated the dangers of the afterlife and was permitted to join the gods. The board itself was typically a rectangle, 30 squares in a grid of 10 by 3. Some squares were marked with symbols, others were left blank. The pieces used, often small cones, spools, or carved figures, varied in material. Some were ivory, others ebony. In royal tombs they were inlaid with lapis lazuli or gold. These were not casual toys. They were crafted with care, designed to endure beyond this world. Senate boards were placed in tombs for good reason. Ancient Egyptians believed the game could be played even after death. Just as the deceased's body was mummified to preserve it for eternity, the Senate board was preserved as a tool of transition, a companion on the soul's journey. It was thought that playing the game helped the Ka, or life force, maneuver through the netherworld's trials. What were the rules? That part remains one of the most debated mysteries in Egyptology. No complete instructions survive, and while some modern scholars have attempted to reconstruct how it may have been played, those reconstructions rely on guesswork, ancient depictions, and scattered textual clues. From what can be pieced together, players likely threw casting sticks, or knucklebones, instead of dice. Movement was determined by the way these fell. Some patterns offered high movement, others none at all. But beyond the mechanics, what fascinates most is the symbolism baked into each move. Some squares were labeled with sacred meanings, like the House of Rebirth, the house of happiness, or the house of waters. Landing on such a square had spiritual consequences. The movement of your piece wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical. You weren't just trying to reach the end of the board, you were trying to escape the chaos of earthly life and pass safely into the afterlife. In many temple wall carvings and papyri, gods were depicted playing Senet themselves. It wasn't uncommon to see Thoth, the god of wisdom, or even Osiris, seated at a board, playing against a human soul. Losing meant delay. Winning meant ascension. The game became a divine trial in miniature, and if even the gods were playing, what chance did mortals have? This ritualistic dimension grew especially pronounced during the 18th dynasty. In tomb paintings, the deceased is sometimes shown playing Senet against invisible opponents, as if the spirit was already mid-journey. In one remarkable tomb, Queen Nefertari is shown seated at a Senet board, her eyes focused, her hands poised to make the next move. It is one of the most elegant depictions we have, silent, dignified, utterly intent, as if her very fate hung on the next turn. The game's influence didn't end with Egypt, it traveled. Variations of Senet have been found in the Levant, Nubia, and even parts of Mesopotamia. Some scholars argue that elements of Senet helped inspire later board games like backgammon or even modern strategy games. But what makes Senet different is not its rules, it's the reverence. No other ancient game carried this much spiritual weight. Imagine a world where every leisure activity was also a religious rehearsal, where entertainment wasn't separate from belief, where a move on a board could be a symbolic prayer. That was the world Senet belonged to, and the boards themselves were crafted to reflect that seriousness. Some were folding boxes, others had small drawers beneath the board, used to store the pieces or casting sticks. Many had inlays of precious stones, etched glyphs, and subtle symbols of protection. When you touched a Senet piece, you weren't simply holding wood or bone, you were holding a charm, a guide, a weapon, even against chaos. The decline of Senet came slowly. By the Greco-Roman period, the game was already fading from use. The rise of new beliefs, shifting cultural practices, and other forms of entertainment pushed Senet into obscurity. Its boards were buried, forgotten in the dust of time, and with them the precise knowledge of how it was played vanished too. But then came rediscovery. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists uncovered Senet boards in tombs across Egypt, sometimes with pieces still in place, as if the player had simply stepped away. Museums now display these boards behind glass, admired for their craftsmanship but rarely understood. And every once in a while, a new theory about the rules surfaces, but no version is definitive. That's part of the mystery. The game still holds its secrets, yet it speaks. Even in silence, it speaks. It reminds us that even in the ancient world, humans craved more than survival. They sought meaning, they looked for patterns, they imagined cosmic games, and gave themselves a part to play. Senet wasn't just about winning, it was about understanding your path, accepting loss, moving forward despite setbacks, trusting that if you stayed true, you'd reach the end, whole. And in that way, Senet feels timeless. It echoes the way we navigate life today, through choices, uncertainty, chance, and strategy, through a mixture of faith and action, through unseen forces and visible results. It's humbling to think that millennia ago someone sat by candlelight, considering their next move just as we do now, with hope, with hesitation, with dreams of what might come next. The sandals that walk to the afterlife. Imagine a pair of sandals, not just any pair, but carefully woven, shaped to fit the feet of someone long gone, someone whose name may have once echoed in palace halls, whose footsteps stirred the dust of Thebes or Abydos. These sandals, now silent and still, were once worn with purpose, not for walking through markets or fields, but for crossing into another world. In ancient Egypt, everything a person owned, everything they touched, wore, used, or valued, might follow them after death. Sandals were no exception, not mere accessories or protection against the hot desert floor, but ritual items, designed to help a soul walk confidently into eternity. Some of these sandals were crafted from papyrus fibers, others were made of leather, dyed and stitched, sometimes with intricate patterns. A few rare pairs were even gilded, made for royals, delicate and never meant to touch the ground. These were shoes made for ceremony, shoes made for the afterlife. You might wonder why sandals? Why would such an ordinary item be included in the burial of pharaohs or priests? To the ancient Egyptians, the journey after death was no dreamlike drift. It was a passage, a road, sometimes even a battle. One walked through the underworld, navigated gates, faced tests. Your feet needed to be ready. Inside the tomb of Tutankhamun, among treasures of gold and statues of divine animals, several pairs of sandals were found. Some were surprisingly small, with soles decorated in ways that seemed symbolic. Enemies of the king painted beneath them, so that with every step he would symbolically trample chaos. Others had images of gods or protective spells etched into the sides. To wear these sandals even in death was to carry protection with every footstep. In one pair, the heel had been slightly worn, perhaps even used in life. Were they a young king's favorite? Were they left in the tomb, not just as tradition, but as something personal, something comforting, something real? It's difficult to say. But these simple items, the kind we barely think about in modern life, held weight beyond words. The idea of shoes for the dead wasn't unique to Egypt. But here, the meaning ran deeper. Sandals were sometimes offered to the gods in temple rituals. Priests wore special pairs only for sacred grounds, and sometimes statues of deities were adorned with footwear, their feet dressed to reflect their status or divine nature. And what's more, some spells in the Book of the Dead specifically mention footwear. One passage says, "I am he who is shod with white sandals." White, a color of purity, of sacred rites, of divine readiness. To be shod, in Egyptian thought, was not merely to dress, but to be prepared, to be equipped to move forward. Now picture the embalming chamber, stone walls, dim oil lamps casting flickering shadows, the smell of resin and myrrh in the air. A body lies still on the ceremonial bench. Carefully, one embalmer's assistant places sandals at the feet, perhaps tying them gently, perhaps pausing for a silent prayer. These sandals are not meant for today. They are not meant for walking the earth. They are meant for the duat, the unseen world. The sandals are part of the soul's toolkit, its passport, its armor. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover these relics, fragile, delicate, barely intact. In museums today, they rest under glass, their woven fibers darkened with age, their soles flaking, their straps brittle. But the story they carry is not brittle at all. It is powerful. It speaks of beliefs held so strongly that even something as humble as a sandal became sacred. One particularly stunning example found in a noblewoman's tomb was made of gold leaf over leather. The artistry was almost obsessive, edges stitched so finely they appear machine-made. Yet these were made by hand, by craftsmen who knew their work would be seen not by humans but by the gods. Even everyday people, those without palaces or pyramids, might be buried with simple sandals. Often they were made by family members, woven in preparation for a journey that none could fully understand, yet all believed in. The symbolism didn't stop at footwear. Egyptians believed the soul, the Ka and Ba, needed mobility. In some depictions, the soul is shown as a bird with a human face, flying from the tomb to visit the living, returning at night to rest. Movement was part of existence, stillness was unnatural, and sandals, well, they were a promise that the journey wasn't over. Some scholars have wondered if this tradition ties back to an even earlier idea, that the dead continued their life, just elsewhere, that their feet touched other ground, that they attended other ceremonies, that they walked under stars unseen by the living. In that context, sandals aren't just practical, they are poetic. They are the bridge between worlds. One ancient funerary text even includes instructions to the soul: put on your sandals, and come forth by day. The meaning is layered: come forth, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a complete being. Come forth prepared, come forth proud. In modern times, we might see shoes as fashion, or comfort, or necessity. But imagine if you knew, truly believed, that your shoes would follow you after death, that they'd be your companions on a cosmic road. Would you choose differently? Would you walk differently? These ancient sandals, now thousands of years old, speak softly but clearly. They whisper stories of belief, of reverence, of quiet preparation for an unknown, eternal destination. They are reminders that in ancient Egypt, nothing was too small to be sacred, not even the shoes on your feet. So next time you walk, whether barefoot or in sandals, whether on stone or soil, remember, to the Egyptians, every step could echo into eternity. And sometimes, the path to forever begins with a single pair of sandals. The spoon that fed the gods. Long before modern utensils existed, long before the polished silverware of empires and the cutlery of kings, there was something far more symbolic in the sands of Egypt. A spoon, small, carved by hand, delicate, and yet holding the weight of divine offering. Not the kind you eat your dinner with, not the kind found in kitchens. This was different. It was sacred. The ancient Egyptians believed that every gesture toward the gods had to be perfect. Every scent, every word, every object offered had to reflect cosmic order. And in temples scattered across the Nile, priests would lift these ritual ladles, spoons really, carved from wood, ivory, or precious faience. These weren't tools, they were bridges, between human and divine. Some were shaped like swimming girls, their bodies gently curved, arms outstretched, carrying the bowl of the spoon as if delivering it directly to the gods. Others took the form of lotus flowers or delicate birds, symbols of rebirth and the soul's journey beyond death. These spoons weren't meant for food, they held perfumes, sacred oils, spices and powders. each believed to nourish the senses of the gods. Imagine it, the flickering torchlight in the temple chamber, the scent of myrrh and frankincense, thick in the air. The priest, steady and quiet, lifting the spoon and pouring out the offering into a stone basin. No words spoken, just a silent ritual, repeated for centuries. It's hard to say when these spoons first appeared, but many discovered so far date back over 3,000 years. And though small in size, they're often found buried with priests, scribes, or members of the elite, those who had the divine right to speak to the heavens. But there's a strange twist in some of these artifacts. One spoon, now sitting quietly in the Louvre, shows a girl swimming. Her figure is slender, elegant, but there's a sadness to her eyes. Egyptologists still debate the symbolism. Was she a servant, a priestess, a spirit caught between worlds? Or was she simply art, a metaphor for the journey of the soul across the waters of death? Another spoon, found in a lesser-known tomb in Thebes, was sealed inside a limestone box. No inscription, no explanation, just the spoon, wrapped in linen, with traces of dried oil and flower dust, as if someone long ago had prepared a final gift for someone they hoped would be welcomed on the other side. These spoons were also tied to Hathor, the goddess of music, fertility, and beauty. In many rituals, the oils carried in these spoons would be placed upon statues of the gods, not as decoration, but as a way of awakening the divine, to feed their senses, to speak without words. And they weren't just ceremonial. Some believe they were also part of healing rituals. The oils used might have carried medicines, scents thought to calm the spirit, or concoctions said to chase away illness and bad dreams. Over time, archaeologists have uncovered spoons that had hieroglyphs carved onto them, messages like to live forever, or to be heard by the gods. Small inscriptions, barely visible to the naked eye, but full of hope and reverence. It's in these tiny objects, these spoons once thought ordinary, that we glimpse the emotional fabric of a civilization, a people who believed in the power of gesture, who believed that the smallest act, done with purity, could echo in eternity. And yet, most of these spoons were never meant to be used twice. Once the ritual was complete, the spoon was sealed away, like a whisper into the afterlife, locked in time. Today, museums label them as ritual ladles or cosmetic spoons, but their true meaning might be forever lost. Their purpose wasn't just function, it was faith, it was beauty, it was mystery. Imagine one now, in the hands of a temple attendant, dipping into a golden vial, raising it to an altar before Ra, the sunlight god. That drop of oil, guided by the curve of the spoon, falling slowly into a basin, as chants echo and the veil between worlds feels just a little thinner. In a world where everything is fast, these spoons remind us that sometimes the quietest gestures carry the deepest meaning, and though they rest behind glass now, silent and still, their purpose lingers. They fed the gods, they offered dreams, and they carried the hopes of a civilization, one drop at a time. The statue that guarded the tomb, Anubis protector. You're lying still now, calm and weightless, and the sands of Egypt begin to shift beneath your mind. Picture it, a dry wind sweeping through the Valley of the Kings. The sunlight, though soft with age, still touches the yellow limestone cliffs with warmth. In the shadow of a forgotten tomb, something waits. Not a person, not a voice, but a statue, a guardian, carved not just to stand, but to protect, to witness, and perhaps to judge. He has the head of a jackal, black as the void, ears sharp and ever alert, his eyes empty and knowing. This is Anubis, not just a god of the dead, but the first and last face a soul might see on its journey. In museum halls today, his statues are small, unassuming. Some sit with paws stretched before them like a resting dog. Others, standing tall, carry staffs or scepters, fixed in silent vigilance. But these carvings, these protectors, are modeled after something much older, a belief so deep that it survived dynasties, droughts, invasions, and time itself. Back then, in tombs sealed and sacred, Anubis wasn't just symbolic, he was present. His statue didn't sit casually by the door, it was placed with intent, always facing inward, always watching. For ancient Egyptians believed that once the tomb was sealed, the soul's journey had only just begun, and it wasn't a peaceful walk. The soul would be tested, navigating the dark hallways of Duat, the Egyptian underworld. It would face gods with crocodile heads, serpents with endless coils, lakes of fire, and walls of silence. The heart of the deceased would be weighed against a single feather, the feather of Ma'at. If it was too heavy with sin, it would be devoured. If it balanced, the soul might reach paradise. So Anubis wasn't just decoration, he was the shepherd of the soul. He led it to judgment. He comforted the dead, embalmed the body, and stood between the tomb and the chaos outside. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine what it must have felt like to be there, not as a tourist, not even as a pharaoh, but as the soul of someone who had just died. You awaken in the tomb you were buried in, stone walls all around you. It's cold, still, but you're not alone. In the flickering light of an eternal flame, Anubis watches you, silently, unmoving. You sense that he's not hostile, but he won't speak. He simply waits, as if your next step is yours to decide. In his presence, you remember rituals performed long before your death. Priests in leopard skins anointing your body, chanting your name, placing amulets upon your chest. You remember the smell of incense, of natron, of oils made from desert flowers, and the mask of Anubis looming over you during the rite of embalming. This wasn't just religion, it was law, it was order, and in death, that order was guarded by the jackal god. Now, slowly open your eyes. Back in today's world, archaeologists have found dozens of Anubis statues. Some are finely carved from ebony wood, others molded from black-painted limestone. Many are no taller than your forearm. But in the famous tomb of Tutankhamun, a life-size statue of Anubis was found crouched before the entrance to the burial chamber. It wasn't just dramatic, it was intentional. The tomb had been robbed, partially. But the inner sanctum remained untouched. The statue, like a sentry, had held its ground. Its eyes had never blinked. And perhaps that's why Tut's secrets survived. There's another tale too, whispered among temple ruins, that priests, when laying a pharaoh to rest, would walk alone into the tomb, carrying the statue of Anubis before them. They'd chant words not meant for the living, and once it was placed at the foot of the sarcophagus, no one would enter again. Even today, in dusty storerooms beneath museums, researchers say there's a strange stillness around these artifacts. Dogs won't bark near them. Visitors feel watched. And when handled, some say they've heard faint scratching, or the feeling of static, just enough to question. Could a statue, lifeless, unmoving, truly hold presence? Ancient Egyptians certainly believed it could. They didn't see gods as distant. The divine lived among them, in the Nile, the stars, and in statues like Anubis. Rituals weren't symbols, they were contracts, binding, sacred. And so when you lie still tonight, think of that statue in the dark, alone, but never lost, watching over the dead, guiding souls in silence, protecting mysteries no living voice can fully explain. Not every guardian needs a sword, some only need to watch. The jar that held perfume, unguent container. Long before bottled scents lined store shelves, the ancient Egyptians were already perfecting the art of fragrance. Not for vanity, but for ritual, for remembrance, for the soul's journey. The unguent jar, small, delicate, yet infinitely significant, sat quietly among the possessions of the elite. Crafted from alabaster, faience, or calcite, these containers weren't just vessels, they were protectors of essence, the essence of luxury, of ritual purity, and of preparation for eternity. In the stillness of a tomb, you might find one, its soft curves worn by time, its neck sealed tight. What lay inside thousands of years ago would have been precious oils, blends of myrrh, frankincense, and exotic resins from lands beyond the Nile. Oils used to anoint the dead, to prepare the body for the afterlife, and to honor the gods who watched from above. For Egyptians, scent wasn't merely sensory, it was spiritual. Each fragrance had a purpose. Some cleansed, others sanctified, and still others were believed to entice deities into accepting prayers. In temple rituals, priests would dip carved ladles into these sacred unguents, carefully spreading them across statues of gods. This wasn't decoration, it was awakening. They believed that through the application of scent, the divine was made present, the god invited to inhabit their earthly form. And yet, unguent containers were just as personal. In life, wealthy Egyptians wore perfume as a sign of status and cleanliness. Small jars would sit on low tables beside mirrors and combs, some even shaped like lotus blossoms or female figures, symbols of beauty and rebirth. Others were sealed with carved stoppers, shaped like falcons, bulls, or protective cobras. But these jars followed their owners into death as well, tucked into burial chambers, sometimes alongside the very perfumes they once held. The belief was simple and beautiful. If your soul might rise again, shouldn't you carry the fragrance of life with you? Archaeologists have uncovered unguent containers still carrying residue from ancient oils. What remains today is a faint echo, a sticky trace of what once perfumed a temple or flesh prepared for burial. And when scientists examine these remnants, they discover ingredients from the Levant, Nubia, and the Horn of Africa. The Egyptians had trade routes that stretched far beyond the horizon. Their scents were a symphony of distant lands. There's a jar in the Cairo Museum, small, no taller than a man's hand. It was found in the tomb of a noblewoman who lived more than 3,000 years ago. Her name has faded from memory, but her scent, captured in that jar, remains. Even today, if you lean close, some claim you can still catch a whiff, something floral, musky and strange, like time itself trapped in a bottle. But even the shape of the jar mattered. Some were narrow-necked to protect their contents from the dry air. Others had wide mouths to allow priests to access the oils during fast-paced temple ceremonies. And still others were designed for travelers, small, portable, meant for the journey beyond the grave. Ancient texts speak of the gods themselves wearing perfume. Ra, it was said, rose with the scent of incense in the morning, and Osiris, god of the afterlife, was anointed with sacred oils before rebirth. In mirroring these divine acts, Egyptians hoped to align themselves with eternal life. In the reign of Hatshepsut, a powerful female pharaoh, ships were sent to the land of Punt, a place of legends, to bring back aromatic treasures. Among them, precious myrrh trees, roots wrapped in wet earth, transported across sea and desert to perfume the very heart of Egypt. Those oils, once refined, likely ended up in ungurnt jars like the ones found in her mortuary temple. The jar, then, was more than a container. It was a symbol of connection, between worlds, between the living and the dead, between earth and sky, between human and God. Some jars were passed down as heirlooms. Others were created solely for burial, never to be opened again. Each one whispered a private story of rituals repeated, of hands that held it, of days when scent filled the air, soft and sacred. And when you look at one today, behind museum glass or in a photograph, you might wonder about the person who last opened it. Were they grieving, celebrating, preparing for their final goodbye? You'll never know for certain, but the jar remains, silent, whole, waiting. The ancient Egyptians believed that memory was scent, that to smell something once known was to awaken the past. In that way, the unguent jar wasn't just a tool, it was a vessel for remembering, and maybe, just maybe, it still is. The tool that measured the Nile, Nilometer rod. Long before satellites traced water from the sky, long before computers tracked rainfall patterns and flood predictions, there was only the river, the Nile. It gave life, it took it, and its rhythm shaped an entire civilization. But how did ancient Egyptians measure something as vast, as unpredictable, and as sacred as the Nile? That's where the Nilometer enters the story. It wasn't just a rod. It wasn't merely a carved stone shaft. It was a bridge between nature and society, between chaos and order, and it held the power to tell priests, kings, and farmers what the year ahead might bring, famine or feast, balance or disaster. But to understand this tool, we need to drift back to when Egypt's survival depended not on armies or gold, but on inches of rising water. Imagine the banks of the Nile in early summer, the air warm, the river still, farmers and families watching the horizon, waiting for signs. The floodwaters always came from the south, from lands they never saw. Ethiopia's rains, miles away, determined the fate of the people standing in the mud here in Egypt. If the waters rose too high, homes would drown. If they rose too little, crops would fail. But if the flood rose just enough, then the land would bloom, the silt would be rich, the wheat would rise, and Egypt would thrive. But how could anyone know? How could anyone predict whether the gods were generous that year, or whether chaos loomed? That's when the priests approached the Nilometer. In some temples, it was a stone column, marked with careful notches. In others, it was a staircase descending into a well that connected with the river. There were versions built on Elephantine Island, on Rhoda Island near Cairo, and in sacred temples along the floodplain. These structures weren't just for ritual, they were instruments. You'd descend slowly, the air cooler the deeper you went, shadows dancing along the damp stone. And then, at the base, you'd hear the murmur of water, the Nile, whispering through channels. They'd watch the water rise along the marked walls. If the height reached a certain level, say 16 cubits, it was a sign, a good year, a perfect balance. If it rose higher, past 18, it could mean destruction. If it stalled at 10, famine might follow. And it wasn't guesswork. These measurements were sacred mathematics, passed down through generations. Entire harvest taxes were calculated based on those readings. Temple offerings changed. The schedule of religious festivals adjusted. Even political decisions, the price of bread, the strength of trade, shifted based on what the Nilometer revealed. You see, in a land that worshipped Maat, the divine principle of balance, order, and truth, the Nile's behavior was more than natural, it was symbolic. If the river raged or vanished, it wasn't just weather, it was a message. Perhaps the gods were displeased. Perhaps a mistake had been made in governance. Perhaps the pharaoh had strayed from the righteous path. And so, when priests read the Nilometer, they weren't just reading water levels, they were reading fate. But there's something even more fascinating. This system, though sacred, was deeply practical. The readings weren't hidden behind mystery, they were publicly announced. Town criers would declare the flood levels so that everyone, farmer, merchant, servant, could prepare. This transparency helped maintain social trust, and it gave the people a sense of predictability in a world where so much seemed at the mercy of unseen forces. Now pause for a moment. Imagine a priest, white-robed, standing before the Nilometer in silence. He watches the water climb one carved notch higher. The sound of the river echoes softly in the chamber. It's not a rush, not a wave, but a rise. Steady, patient, unstoppable. He records it on a papyrus scroll, handing it to a scribe. The message is clear. This will be a fruitful year. Or, perhaps not. And with that single reading, a cascade of events begins. Farmers begin to prepare their tools. Temple workers plan upcoming offerings. Bakers anticipate the price of grain. And far away, in the palace, the pharaoh receives word. The Nile has spoken. It's a remarkable idea that the height of water in a shaft could influence the destiny of millions. And the Nilometer lasted centuries. Even after Greek and Roman rulers took over, they continued the practice. Even into the early Islamic periods, Nilometers were still being maintained. The tool outlasted dynasties, outlasted wars, because it worked, and because it reminded people that life, however complicated, was still connected to something steady, the river's rhythm. But beyond its function, the Nilometer is a symbol, a quiet one, humble in appearance, but profound in meaning. It's a testament to how the ancients understood nature, not as something to conquer, but to read, to respect, to align with. And isn't that something we've forgotten? Today, with satellites and simulations, we can measure almost anything, but few things we measure hold meaning the way the Nile did for the Egyptians. They didn't just check the water, they listened to it. The Nilometer is a relic of a time when every inch of water carried a whisper from the gods. It's still there, some of them. Quiet, empty, stone steps vanishing into darkness. You can visit one if you like. Stand at its edge, and if you're still enough, if the city noise fades, maybe you'll hear the ancient water speak again. The headdress that marked rebirth, vulture crown. In a land where symbolism whispered through every carved wall and painted scroll, where the stars guided both kings and commoners alike, one emblem stood silently above royal brows, a crown shaped like a vulture. Not just a decorative headdress, but a sacred relic woven into the heart of Egypt's beliefs. Tonight we step gently into the story of the vulture crown, a symbol of rebirth, protection, and divine authority. Imagine standing in the shadow of a temple, far from the modern world, where dust floats lazily in the golden afternoon light. In the cool of the stone corridors, there are carvings, not of war or empire, but of a goddess. Her wings outstretched, eyes unwavering. This is Nekhbet, the vulture goddess of Upper Egypt, and the crown that bore her likeness was no mere ornament. It was a promise, a shield, a key to eternity. For thousands of years, Egyptian queens and priestesses wore the vulture crown as a symbol of maternal guardianship. But it was more than just a sign of nobility. It represented the cosmic order of life and death. The vulture, misunderstood in modern eyes, was sacred to the ancients. It was not a scavenger, but a purifier, a life-giver. And in the ancient Egyptian worldview, it stood at the edge of transformation between this world and the next. The crown itself was often made of gold, soft yet enduring. Sometimes it was crafted from linen and adorned with intricate embroidery. Other times, feathers, real or symbolic, were layered with care, stitched by hands that believed they were weaving divinity. A serpent, the uraeus, was often attached to the front, coiled in eternal readiness to strike down evil. The wearer, crowned in these sacred forms, was not merely a ruler. She became a vessel of the gods. Queen Amos Nefertari, Hatshepsut Nefertiti. These names echo in the chambers of history, and each is linked to this sacred headdress. When they appeared before their people, or the gods, they didn't simply wear power, they embodied it. The crown reminded all who looked upon them that they were not just leaders, but guardians of cosmic balance. And it wasn't only for ceremony. In tombs, queens were buried with replicas of the crown, ensuring that even in death, they remained under Nekhbet's protective gaze. They believed that the vulture's wings would carry them through the perilous journey of the afterlife, shielding them from chaos and leading them to eternal life. Even the positioning of the crown held meaning. The feathers pointed toward the sky, the goddess's face looking forward. It was always forward, always guarding, always ready. When archaeologists began unearthing the remnants of royal burials, they found traces of these crowns among the linen wrappings and shattered amulets. In some cases, the gold had been looted long ago, but the impressions in the wrappings, the negative space where feathers once were, still told their story, like ghostly echoes in the silence of sand-covered crypts. And what of the women who wore them? Their faces, preserved in sculptures and wall paintings, are often serene, not cold, but calm, almost as if they knew something we don't, as if they carried the weight of more than a kingdom. as if they held a secret that the vulture whispered only to those chosen to wear her form. One of the most haunting finds comes from the Valley of the Queens, where the resting place of Queen Nefertari was discovered. Her tomb, breathtaking in its preservation, shows her journey through the afterlife with vivid colors and celestial guides. Though the crown itself had long disappeared, its presence is felt, painted across walls, floating above her in ceremonial form. It is as if the crown continues to guide her, even now, deep within the silence of stone. What's striking is how this symbol, rooted in such an ancient time, still feels deeply human. The desire to protect, to nurture, to transform pain into purpose. That's what the vulture represented. That's what the crown embodied. It wasn't about royalty alone. It was about responsibility, about watching over a people, a land, and a destiny, even when the world trembled with change. Today, replicas of the vulture crown sit behind glass in museums across the world. Tourists pass by, some pausing, others barely noticing. But those who take a moment to look closely, who lean in to see the curve of gold, the delicate feather patterns, they might feel something else. A quiet hum, a stillness, as though the past is breathing just beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered. This crown, worn by queens and carved by craftsmen, whispers still, of loyalty, of the divine feminine, of guardianship that stretches beyond life into the embrace of eternity. And tonight, as we drift into sleep, let your mind wander there, to a palace corridor washed in moonlight. A queen walks slowly, her footsteps soft. A golden crown rests upon her brow. It does not weigh her down, it lifts her. The goddess above, her wings outstretched, watching, protecting, forever. The figurine that served in death. Shabti worker. Long before modern civilization kept records of time, the ancient Egyptians had already begun preparing for something far greater than death. To them, the afterlife wasn't an end, but a continuation, a second life, shaped by rituals, obligations, and cosmic order. And one of the strangest objects to emerge from this belief system was something deceptively small. It could fit in your hand, yet it was tasked with serving a soul for all eternity. Buried in tombs, alongside priests, workers, and even pharaohs, this object was no ornament. It was a worker, silent, still, yet deeply important. The ancient Egyptians called them shabtis. At first glance, a shabti might look like a miniature statue, sometimes made of wood, sometimes faience, sometimes carved in stone. Some wore simple kilts, others were more elaborately adorned, but almost all of them held farming tools, hoes, baskets, pickaxes, because these weren't toys, these weren't symbols of status, they were laborers. To understand why a tiny, lifeless figure was buried with the dead, we have to journey deep into the Egyptian belief system, into the Book of the Dead, into spells, and into a civilization obsessed with cosmic balance. In the ancient Egyptian afterlife, the soul didn't just rest peacefully, it had work to do. You see, in the Field of Reeds, an idealized version of Egypt's fertile Nile Valley, the dead were expected to maintain the land, farming, irrigating, harvesting. The afterlife was paradise, yes, but it was not idle. But not everyone wanted to toil in the next world. That's where the shabtis came in. Inscribed on their bodies was often a spell, spell 6 from the Book of the Dead. It was a command, a trigger. If the gods called upon the deceased to do work, the shabti would rise and respond. O shabti, if I am called upon, if I am to do any work, you shall say, I am here. In other words, the shabti would serve as a substitute, a stand-in worker, a soul's eternal assistant. And there wasn't just one. High-status tombs contained dozens, sometimes hundreds of shabtis, an overseer shabti for every 10 workers. Some tombs even contained an entire miniature labor force. Imagine that, a whole afterlife workforce, made of figurines. But these weren't always generic. Some were inscribed with the name of the deceased, others were personalized, each representing a unique function. Archaeologists have uncovered shabtis carrying sacks, shabtis with water jars, even shabtis wielding sickles, and over time, they evolved. In Egypt's Middle Kingdom, they were simpler, often just clay or wood, without inscriptions. But by the New Kingdom, they had become more elaborate, glazed faience, carved hieroglyphs, deep cobalt blues, detailed features. The ancient Egyptians were now embedding spells directly onto their shabtis, turning them into magical surrogates. And yet there's a strange contradiction here. These were lifeless objects, buried in the still silence of tombs, and yet they were considered alive in function, capable, obedient, even sentient, in some magical sense. But what happens when you start to mass-produce souls? That's the mystery many archaeologists still wrestle with today. Were shabtis truly viewed as spiritual extensions of the deceased? Or had they become ritualistic habits, symbols of wealth and belief, but stripped of meaning? In the Valley of the Kings, tombs like that of Seti I and Ramesses IV reveal entire walls lined with Shaptis, not a dozen, not 50, but over 400, enough to form a posthumous army. And in Saqqara, archaeologists unearthed Shaptis from the tomb of a high priest, each more intricate than the last. Some bore texts from not just spell 6, but custom funerary passages. These weren't just figurines, they were tools, tokens, and possibly something more. There are theories, of course. One suggests the Shapti ritual was a psychological comfort, a way for the living to cope with the mystery of death. Another theory points to power, that owning hundreds of Shaptis wasn't just spiritual insurance, it was a statement of status, a display of afterlife luxury. And some scholars believe that Shaptis weren't always passive. They may have symbolized the continuity of identity, that a part of the soul, called the Ka, could reside in more than one place. The Shapti, in this sense, became not just a servant, but a vessel, a split identity, a shadow of the self. This interpretation is unsettling. If each Shapti carried the name and essence of the dead, were these souls fragmented, multiplied? Was the afterlife a realm where identity could be distributed across dozens of figures, each responding to a divine call? The question lingers. But one thing is certain. To the Egyptians, death wasn't a void, it was a system, a bureaucracy, a field where crops grew, and tasks were assigned, and balance had to be maintained. And in that world, you didn't just prepare your soul, you prepared your workforce. Even now, museums across the world display Shaptis in glass cases. Behind them, little placards, worker figurine, afterlife assistant. But to understand them properly, you have to look past the label, past the artifact, and imagine the world they were made for. A world where every tomb was a home, where every soul had duties, and where the tiniest figurine could bear the weight of eternity. Shaptis didn't walk, they didn't breathe, but in the minds of their creators, they would one day answer the gods, "I am here." Even now, thousands of years later, they still seem ready, waiting. The amulet that guarded the womb, Tawret talisman. In the silent chambers of ancient Egyptian homes, amid flickering oil lamps and the muted murmur of prayers whispered at night, there existed an object not of vanity or beauty, but of divine protection. A small amulet, worn close to the skin, or placed beside a bed, shaped like a strange hybrid of a hippopotamus, lioness, crocodile, and human. Its form was no accident. This was Tawret, the Great One, a goddess of terrifying appearance yet gentle intent, protector of expectant mothers, guardian of childbirth, and fierce defender of newborns entering a dangerous world. The people of ancient Egypt feared death, but they feared the fragility of birth even more. And in a land where both divinity and danger walked side by side, no moment was more perilous than a woman bringing forth life. The Tawret talisman was their answer, a silent protector called upon in times when the veil between life and death was thinnest. Carved from faience or stone, the amulet bore the image of the goddess standing upright, her large belly symbolizing pregnancy, her paws clutching the sas sign of protection. She was not elegant, nor refined, but that was never her purpose. She was primal, she was power incarnate, and to the women who clutched her image during labor, she was hope. In many archaeological sites across Egypt, from grand temples to modest village homes, these talismans have been unearthed beside cribs, under floorboards, and even wrapped among burial linens. Some are simple, others intricately detailed. Some feature her alone, others pair her with the dwarf god bees forming a duo of divine guardianship. But across thousands of years, one message remained constant: Tawret watches, and Tawret protects. When a woman became pregnant, rituals began, prayers were whispered, offerings laid, and the talisman of Tawret was placed at her side. The ancient Egyptians saw childbirth, not as a biological event, but a sacred passage fraught with spiritual trials. Spirits of chaos lurked in the shadows, the boundaries between realms weakened. It was Tawret who stood at the threshold, snarling at evil, stomping with her crocodile tail, and baring her teeth at anything that might harm mother or child. Even in tombs the talisman was present, not to ensure safe birth, but to symbolically guard the rebirth of the soul, because if birth was the entry to life, then death was merely a second birth into eternity. And Tawret, in all her strange, powerful glory, was there for both. One artifact now resting in the British Museum is made from bright turquoise faience. It's no larger than a thumb, the details are faint, worn by time, but her outline remains. Snout protruding, paws forward, the unmistakable posture of divine readiness. Imagine a mother 3,000 years ago gripping that very talisman, eyes clenched, sweat on her brow, praying to the Great One. Not just for survival, but for strength. To modernize, the figure of Tawret may appear grotesque, an odd choice for a goddess of fertility. But the Egyptians understood something deeper. that beauty lies in strength, that protection doesn't come in soft forms, but in ferocious guardians willing to face down chaos itself. Her body, a collage of fierce animals, represented raw power. Her name, Tauret, she who is great, was not poetic flattery, it was fact. As Egypt evolved, so too did the use of the amulet. In some periods it became more symbolic than functional, a nod to ancient ways rather than an active tool. But even then, in the chaos of changing dynasties, foreign invasions, and crumbling temples, the presence of Tauret endured. She lingered in art, in prayer, and in the quiet moments before birth. Interestingly, some scholars believe that the talisman's use extended beyond just childbirth, that it may have played a role in fertility rituals, dream magic, and even warding off nightmares. Children were known to sleep with them under their pillows. Pregnant women wore them on leather cords, and priests of certain temples may have carried them in healing rites. Today, thousands of years later, replicas of the Tauret talisman are sold in museum gift shops, not as religious items, but as symbols of resilience. They serve as reminders of a time when gods walked with people, when birth was a sacred battle, and when protection came in the form of a mother-hippo-lion hybrid with the courage of a storm. So as you rest now, drifting into sleep, think of the women of ancient Egypt, silent in the night, breath slow, hands on their bellies, with a single amulet beside them. An image carved in stone, shaped by faith, and empowered by a belief that some things are simply too precious not to protect. Let your thoughts soften. Let the rhythm of history wrap around you. The talisman still guards, not just against darkness but against forgetting, and somewhere, under layers of dust and time, Tauret still stands watch. The jar that held sacred ink. Scribe's ink pot. In a world where stone monuments reached for the sun and pharaohs were deified as gods, the scribe's tools were quiet instruments of immortality. Among them, a small, unassuming object held an outsized role, the scribe's ink pot. It was no ordinary jar. It was the keeper of thought, memory, and magic, and like many objects in ancient Egypt, it was more than just a tool. It was a bridge between the mortal and the divine. This was the vessel that preserved the voice of kings. It recorded laws, victories, myths, and mysteries. But beyond its role as a recorder of history, the inkpot represented something sacred. Every line it helped write was believed to echo in the afterlife. Every decree it marked was bound by Ma'dut, order, truth, and harmony. Made of ceramic, ivory, or alabaster, these jars were often small enough to sit in the palm of a hand. Some had compartments for black and red ink. Black was used for daily script histories, prayers, chronicles. Red was reserved for sacred names, headings, and dangers. Even the colors had symbolic weight, and the brush that dipped into the pot, usually a reed sharpened at the tip, was considered an extension of Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom. In many tombs, scribes were buried with their inkpots close by, sometimes clutched in hand, sometimes laid beside them like a trusted companion. It wasn't just a tool, it was identity. In the afterlife, the soul might need to record its journey, write petitions, or inscribe spells. The inkpot was insurance, it was preparation. But where did this reverence for writing begin? The earliest signs of Egyptian script date back to around 3000 BCE, carved on temple walls, pottery, and ivory tags. Yet even before papyrus was widely used, Egyptians were already thinking in terms of symbols, pictures that weren't just words but carriers of spiritual essence. To write a name was to give it life. To strike it from stone was to erase it from existence. The act of writing itself was power. Inside the homes of elite scribes, the inkpot sat beside ink palettes and brushes, often alongside tiny figures of Thoth. Some had built-in lids, others were open bowls, some were simple, others were adorned with symbols, ankhs, scarabs, or eyes of Horus. The shape didn't matter as much as the act, the brush dipping, the ink flowing, the scrolls unfolding, and unlike many ancient societies, where writing was the domain of priests or kings alone, in Egypt, the scribal class was vast. Scribes were administrators, engineers, temple clerks, and accountants. Their work held the kingdom together. Every grain of wheat stored, every military campaign, every offering to the gods, it was all recorded. In temples, scribes worked in semi-darkness, surrounded by chants and incense, copying sacred hymns and invocations. The inkpot, often resting on a low stool or held in a belt pouch, was a silent witness. Day after day, decade after decade, it spilled ink onto papyrus scrolls that would outlive the people who penned them. And while many of those scrolls have crumbled, the inkpots themselves remain. Archaeologists have found them buried in sand, inside tombs, and even hidden inside statue bases. Some still have traces of dried red or black ink at the bottom. Ink made from crushed minerals mixed with water and plant gum. In one particular tomb in Saqqara, a beautifully preserved ink pot was found near the mummy of a scribe. Carved from calcite, the pot had a delicate inscription. "He who writes for the gods, may his words rise like incense." Beside it, a palette and a single reed brush, still intact after 2,000 years. But even more intriguing are the invisible stories. The texts we'll never see, written with ink from similar pots, contracts signed in private chambers, letters to loved ones, spells to ward off evil. What messages were etched in those lines? What hopes, confessions, or truths? The scribe's ink pot didn't just hold ink, it held intent. Every drop was a decision. Every stroke could honor a god, condemn a man, or secure a soul's peace. And so, in a kingdom where pyramids touched the sky and temples sprawled across desert plains, this little jar played a quiet, critical role. It didn't shine, it didn't roar, but it wrote, and what it wrote endured. Even today, when we open a museum case and see a clay or bronze ink pot resting behind glass, we're not just looking at an object, we're glimpsing a tool that helped shape civilization, a vessel that once carried the weight of an empire's voice. So next time you think of ancient Egypt, think beyond the gold masks and towering statues. Think of the ink, think of the hands that held the reed brush, dipped it in black or red, and pressed it onto papyrus. Think of the ink pot, the jar that once held sacred thought and carried it through time. Because in that tiny jar was Egypt's memory, and it still speaks. The rise of Akhenaten. In the heart of ancient Egypt, long before the golden masks and the towering temples became familiar icons of its past, there was a man who changed everything. His name would echo through corridors of time, not just as a king, but as a revolutionary, Akhenaten. But he wasn't always Akhenaten. He was born as Amenhotep IV, into a world already rich with traditions, gods and pharaohs who ruled with divine authority. Egypt was powerful, stable, its rituals were precise, its religion based on a complex pantheon of gods, deeply rooted in every aspect of life, from the crown on the king's head to the bread baked by a peasant. Everyone had their place, every god had its domain. And so, when this prince was born to Pharaoh Amenhotep III and Queen Taye, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The boy was a royal child, one of several in the court. His early life was spent mostly in the shadows of the older siblings and the grandeur of his father's reign. We don't know the exact details of his childhood, because like much of ancient Egypt, records were lost, destroyed, or never made in the first place. But there are clues, hints in crumbling inscriptions and surviving sculptures. Amenhotep III, his father, was one of the most successful pharaohs in Egyptian history. He built monumental structures, expanded diplomatic ties, and held a powerful empire together through both force and marriage alliances. The Egypt that young Amenhotep IV was born into was thriving. It was full of certainty, but that would not last. Even from the beginning, there was something different about this young prince. Later depictions of him as an adult, slender, elongated features, narrow shoulders, and wide hips suggest that even his appearance challenged the norm. Whether those depictions were accurate or symbolic, no one knows for certain. But one thing is clear: he didn't follow the path expected of him. As a young royal, he would have been trained in religion, politics, and war. He would have studied alongside priests and generals, preparing for a future he wasn't yet sure would come. His elder brother, Thutmose, was the apparent heir. But when Thutmose died, suddenly, and without clear cause, the path to the throne opened for Amenhotep IV. He became pharaoh around 1353 BCE, and that moment quietly shifted the course of history. At first, his reign seemed traditional. He completed some of his father's construction projects. He honored old temples. The court remained loyal. The sun rose and set, just as it had for generations. But beneath the surface, something was stirring. Amenhotep IV had ideas, unusual ones. He began to speak of the Aten, not a god with the face of a falcon or the head of a jackal, like Ra or Anubis, but simply the sun disk itself, a round, radiant orb, reaching down to touch the world with long rays that ended in hands. This was not just another god in the Egyptian pantheon. This to Amenhotep IV was the god, the only god, and this idea was radical. Egyptian religion didn't function with one god. It was built on many, hundreds of deities, some major, some local, all interconnected. To single one out was dangerous. To say that one alone should be worshipped was revolutionary. But that's exactly what Amenhotep IV did. He began building temples dedicated solely to Aten, not dark, enclosed sanctuaries like the temples of Amun or Osiris, but open courtyards, exposed to the sun. He didn't just build them, he redesigned religious architecture itself to reflect this belief. And then he made it official. He changed his name. Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, no longer suited him. He became Akhenaten, effective for Aten. This wasn't just a name change, it was a public break from Egypt's dominant religion. A clear message that the pharaoh was no longer aligned with Amun, the most powerful god of the traditional priesthood. And with that, Akhenaten began to dismantle the old order. Temples of Amun were shut down, statues were defaced, the priests who had grown enormously powerful over generations found themselves pushed aside, their influence, their rituals, their income, all threatened. But Akhenaten wasn't content to stop there. He left Thebes, the grand religious capital, and founded a new city entirely from scratch. In the middle of the desert, it was called Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. Today we know it as Amarna. This city rose quickly, palaces, homes, workshops, temples, all designed in a completely new style. The art was different. It showed Akhenaten in more casual, intimate poses, playing with his daughters, kissing his queen, Nefertiti. It was human, soft, and unlike anything seen before in Egyptian royal depictions. The religious focus of the entire empire shifted to this new city and its singular god. And for a moment, it worked. Akhenaten ruled from Amarna. The sun shone down on a new capital. Worshippers gathered in open courtyards. Hymns were sung to the Aten, celebrating the warmth and light of the solar disk. Nefertiti stood beside the pharaoh, sharing power in a way few Egyptian queens had. Together they presented an image of divine harmony under the singular light of Aten. But not everyone was convinced. Outside of Akhenaten's carefully controlled city, resistance simmered. The traditional priesthood had not vanished. The people accustomed to their familiar gods and rituals continued their private worship in homes and villages. The bureaucracy, the military, and even foreign allies grew uneasy. The stability that Egypt had enjoyed under previous pharaohs began to crack. Diplomatic letters from other nations during this time speak of disorder. Local governors begged Egypt for help as rebellions flared and resources dwindled. But from Amarna, the response was often silence. Akhenaten seemed uninterested in the politics beyond his spiritual vision. His focus remained fixed on the Aten, even as Egypt's influence abroad began to falter. And then, something happened. The historical record becomes murky here. The last years of Akhenaten's reign are unclear. Did he lose control? Did his vision falter? Was there unrest in his own city? We don't know, but eventually he vanished from power. Some believe he died in Amarna. Others suspect he was forced to abdicate. There are even theories, unconfirmed of course, that he was assassinated. Whatever the case, his religious revolution died with him. Within just a few years, the old gods returned. Temples were reopened. Statues of Amun were restored. The priests regained their power. The city of Akhenaten was abandoned, left to be reclaimed by the desert. And Akhenaten, his name was chiseled out of monuments. His memory condemned. Egypt tried to erase him from history, as if the decades he ruled were an uncomfortable dream. But the traces survived. And today, when we look at the art from Amarna, when we read the strange poetic hymns to the Akhenaten, when we see the radical shift in how kings presented themselves during his reign, we're reminded of a man who dared to believe in something different. Akhenaten wasn't just a king, he was a mystery, a disruptor, a ruler who for a brief moment in time believed that one truth, one light, could reshape the world. And whether it was devotion or delusion, courage or blindness, his vision still stands as one of the most unusual chapters in Egypt's long, complex history. The desert may have taken back the stones of Akhenaten, but the ideas he left behind still cast shadows. Not fully explained, not entirely forgotten, just waiting. Divine order and Ma'at. In ancient Egypt, the world wasn't chaotic or random. It wasn't left to fate or mere survival. Life, death, government, and even the journey of the sun across the sky followed a sacred law, a principle so central to their entire civilization that without it, they believed the world itself would collapse. This principle was Ma'at. Ma'at wasn't just a goddess, though she was often shown as a woman with an ostrich feather on her head. Her true form wasn't something that could be sculpted in stone or painted on a temple wall. Ma'at was order, balance, truth, harmony, the steady rhythm that held the universe together. And to the ancient Egyptians, it wasn't just spiritual, it was literal. Every morning, the sun god Ra sailed across the sky in his golden boat. Every evening, he descended into the underworld to battle the forces of chaos. And each time he emerged victorious, the Egyptians believed it was because Ma'at was upheld. Without her, the sun might not rise, the Nile might not flood, the crops might fail. Chaos, Isfet, would win. So Ma'at became the guiding rule of everything. Pharaohs ruled not just by power, but by their ability to uphold Ma'at. If a king allowed corruption, inequality, or disunity, they weren't just failing politically, they were threatening the cosmic balance of all things. Their failure could bring droughts, invasions, or plague. Their duty wasn't just to govern, but to hold the world together. Inside temples, priests whispered prayers that aligned with Ma'at. In courtrooms, judges weighed truth not only with evidence, but with cosmic balance in mind. The symbol of justice, a scale. On one side, a human heart. On the other, the feather of Ma'at. Too heavy with guilt or falsehood, and the soul would be devoured in the afterlife. Even the scribes, the record keepers, historians, and civil servants were trained to write with Ma'at, not just accuracy, but harmony. A well-kept record was a tribute to the gods, a form of sacred order. Lies weren't just wrong, they were violations of the natural world. From the pharaoh's golden crown to the worker stacking bricks along the Nile, everyone had a role to play in preserving Ma'at. It wasn't fear-based obedience, it was reverence, a shared understanding that the universe operated best when humans mirrored its harmony. Ma'at taught that there was a right time and place for everything. Seasons had their rhythm, rituals had their sequence, even death was seen not as an end, but a return to balance. The Book of the Dead wasn't a map to heaven, it was a guide to live rightly, so that when your heart was weighed, it would be in perfect balance with the feather. And yet, Ma'at wasn't cold or mechanical, she was patient, wise, and forgiving. Those who strayed could realign themselves through offerings, actions, or service. The idea wasn't perfection, it was participation. A farmer tilling his field in time with the flood. A mother teaching her children respect. A mason carving smooth lines into a tomb. All of it was Ma'at. This belief system gave Egypt a stability almost unmatched in history. For over 3,000 years, dynasties rose and fell, but the core belief in balance and truth endured. It shaped how they saw foreigners, how they prepared for the afterlife, how they built their homes and cities. In fact, the very layout of temples and cities followed this sacred geometry. East aligned with birth, west with death. Statues faced the sun. Columns echoed the shape of bundled reeds, nature brought into stone, symbolizing the taming of chaos into harmony. Even in the smallest details, Ma'at showed her presence. The symmetry of hieroglyphs, the even spacing of pillars, the deliberate patterns in clothing and jewelry. Every inch of their world reminded them, life had an order, and humans had the responsibility to live in accordance with it. And in times of crisis, whether war, famine, or rebellion, Egyptians didn't just blame bad luck or bad leadership. They feared Ma'at had been disturbed. Restoring her meant more than treaties or harvests. It meant rituals, rebuilding temples, recentering the cosmic scale. We can still feel echoes of this today. In their temples, their tombs, their laws carved in stone, their gods and calendars and myths, all rooted in a belief that the universe wants to be in balance, that chaos is always waiting, but can be kept at bay through truth, order, and right action. And it was this sacred truth, Ma'at, that Akhenaten would soon challenge. But before we get there, take a deep breath. Let your mind drift into the warm winds of the Nile. Imagine the sun shimmering across the desert sands, a world where time moved in sacred circles, where every footstep, every sunrise, every word spoken had meaning. The chapter of Ma'at reminds us, balance is not just peace, it's survival, and in ancient Egypt, they lived every moment in devotion to that truth. The tomb that refused a name, the KV-55 Enigma. In the heart of Egypt's Valley of the Kings, where desert winds whisper over sand-swept ridges, there lies a tomb unlike any other. Numbered KV-55. It's not as grand as Tutankhamun's or as decorative as the tombs of the pharaohs who came before. But what it lacks in splendor, it more than makes up for in questions. This is a tomb that refuses to give up its secrets. A chamber carved deep into rock, hidden for over 3,000 years. And when it was finally opened, what lay inside didn't fit any pattern Egyptologists had come to expect. There was a body. But whose? A jumble of funerary items, but from different reigns. A name, chiseled out deliberately. And that's where the story begins. The tomb was discovered in 1907 by a team led by Edward Ayrton, working under the wealthy sponsor Theodore Davis. The entrance had been buried under rubble, intact, untouched, but what they found inside wasn't a typical royal burial. The sarcophagus had been desecrated. Its golden cartouche, the oval shape that should have held a royal name, had been gouged out with such carelessness that it left jagged marks. Someone had tried to erase the memory of the person inside. The first thing that struck the excavators was how confused the burial seemed. Artifacts were scattered. Amulets in canopic jars that should have matched in style and period didn't. It was as if someone had quickly assembled a burial using whatever was available at the time. And then there was the body, a single skeleton, mummified, lying inside a ruined coffin that had clearly been built for someone else. The faceplate had once shown the likeness of a king, but again defaced, the name missing. Why would someone go to such lengths to erase a king's identity, unless they wanted that person forgotten forever? When forensic scientists began examining the remains, more questions emerged. The bones belonged to a man, likely in his 20s when he died. Tall, slightly built, but the bones showed signs of stress, curved limbs, a possible genetic disorder. For years experts debated the identity. Some believed it was Smenkhkare, a mysterious ruler who reigned briefly after Akhenaten. Others thought it might even be Akhenaten himself, the heretic pharaoh who changed everything about Egypt's religion. If it were Akhenaten, why the disrespect? If not, why was he buried with items clearly connected to Akhenaten's family? And the coffin, once meant for a woman, modified to fit a male body. The telltale signs of feminine features crudely altered. It was a hasty burial, but for someone important, very important. Then came the clues. Small, but powerful. The 4 canopic jars, which should have held the organs of the deceased, featured the face of a queen, Queen Tiye, mother of Akhenaten, and inscriptions linked the burial to the Amarna period, a time of radical religious reform when the worship of many gods was replaced with the singular sun disk, Aten. This tomb, it seemed, had ties to the very heart of one of Egypt's most controversial eras, yet still, no name. What makes KV-55 so mysterious isn't just what's in it, it's what's missing. No wall paintings, no protective spells, no traditional Book of the Dead, just plain stone and silence. In ancient Egypt, to have your name erased was a fate worse than death. It meant the soul could never reach the afterlife. You were condemned to eternal oblivion. So, who wanted this man forgotten? There are theories. Some believe it was the priests of Amun, restoring the old gods after Akhenaten's heretical reign. Others suggest it was even Tutankhamun himself, or his advisors, who tried to rewrite the past and distance the boy king from his controversial father. But erasing a name didn't erase the bones, and science caught up. In 2010, a DNA analysis linked the KV-55 mummy to Tutankhamun, proving, most likely, that this was indeed Akhenaten. That would make KV-55 not just a forgotten tomb, but the final resting place of one of history's most revolutionary figures. And yet, the tomb remains untouched by grandeur, no ceremony, no honor, just a man buried in silence by those who once followed him. There's something deeply haunting about KV-55. Not because it holds a ghost, but because it holds a silence louder than words. A man once called divine, now lying in anonymity. A king who changed everything and was nearly lost to history. But the desert never forgets, and neither does stone. And now, over a century since its discovery, the KV-55 tomb continues to puzzle everyone who studies it, because even when the science is done and the DNA matches, the question lingers. Why was his name erased? Was it fear, hatred, regret, or something deeper? That is a question only the sands of Egypt may ever answer, and perhaps they never will. The eye that sees all. Horus Amulet lore. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're standing beneath a pale desert sky. The horizon is still. The wind carries whispers of forgotten rituals, and in your hand, you hold something small, yet strangely powerful. A carved amulet, shaped like an eye. Ancient, worn smooth, etched in a language that time itself has tried to erase. This is the Eye of Horus. Not a symbol, not merely a decoration, but a language of protection, power, and perception. Long before modern medicine, security systems, or spiritual advisors, there was this eye, revered across dynasties, buried with kings, hung around the necks of soldiers, children, and even animals. And what's curious is no one treated it as a symbol of belief. They treated it as if it worked, as if the eye actually saw. Let's begin there. The story of the Eye of Horus isn't just a story of a charm, it's the myth of sight itself. A myth so old that it existed before the word Egypt was even etched into stone. The myth goes like this. Horus, the falcon-headed god of the sky, once battled Set, the god of chaos. It was not a fight for glory, it was a fight for justice. A fight to avenge Horus's father, Osiris. In this epic battle, Horus lost his left eye, torn from his head, shattered. But the eye was not gone, it was healed, restored, and it returned, more powerful than before. The Egyptians called it Wadjet, a name that suggests not just healing, but eternal watching, a protector, a keeper of truth. And from then on, they believed that this eye could be invoked, that by carving its curves, its spiral, its marks, they could channel Horus's divine sight. It appeared everywhere, on tombs, on boats, in temples, sometimes hidden inside coffins, not for display, but for protection, so the dead could see the path ahead and be seen by the gods. Even the eye itself had mathematics behind it. Each part of the Eye of Horus represented a fraction, the eyebrow, the tear line, the pupil, each assigned a part of a whole. But when you added all those parts, it never quite made one. There was always a missing piece, a final fraction, never included. as if to say, nothing is ever truly complete. Not even vision, not even knowledge. That tiny mystery haunted scholars for centuries. Why build a system that always falls just short? Perhaps that was the point, that the gods always saw more than mortals, that even a perfect amulet reminded you of your limits. It's why pharaohs wore the eye across their chest when they entered battle, why fishermen tied it to their nets, why women in childbirth clutched it like a lifeline, and why to this day, in markets across Egypt, you can still find versions of it sold on quiet side streets, handmade, blessed, carved into silver, lapis lazuli, and faience. There's something else too, something more subtle. When archaeologists began studying mummies closely, they found many with Horus eyes sewn into their bandages, not for decoration, but over vital organs, over the heart, over the throat, over the lungs, as if the ancient priests knew that vision didn't begin in the eyes, but in the soul. And here's the part that gives people chills. In the famous tomb of Tutankhamun, arguably Egypt's most iconic burial site, Eye of Horus amulets were everywhere, carved into chests, painted onto walls, but one in particular stood out, a tiny pendant, made not from gold, but from desert glass. Yes, glass, created by a meteor impact. It's called Libyan desert glass, formed when a comet or asteroid exploded over the sands of North Africa thousands of years ago. A heat blast so intense it melted the sand into a yellow-green stone. That's what Tutankhamun's eye was made from, an object forged from celestial fire. Now think about that. An amulet, meant to give divine sight, was crafted from a material literally fallen from the sky. Coincidence? Or did they know something? Even today, no one can say how much the ancients understood about meteorites, cosmic forces, or desert alchemy, but they saw that glass, and chose it, not for beauty, but for power. Maybe they believed that if a god ever did see the earth, he would leave behind an eye like that, one made not from this world, and so, it's no wonder that for centuries, the Eye of Horus became more than a symbol, it became a key. Some say it unlocks vision, others say it protects your soul, but in truth, the eye asks one question: are you ready to be seen? Not just by others, but by something greater, by whatever still watches from the sky, from the tombs, from the sands. Tonight, as the desert winds settle and the stars shift gently overhead, somewhere in the silence, the Eye of Horus still looks back, still waiting, still watching. Sleep well, if you can. The Altar of Crocodile Kings, Calm Ombo Mystery. There is a quiet bend along the Nile, where the river slows just enough for stillness to settle in. The sun dips behind low hills. The water glows in shades of bronze and blue. Birds skim across the surface, and the air for a moment stands still. But just behind the riverbanks, there lies a ruin that never sleeps. This is Calm Ombo, a temple unlike any other in Egypt. Its stones are scarred, its walls lean slightly with age, and its foundations rest on a place that was once feared as much as it was worshipped. Because here, the gods weren't just honored, they were obeyed, and one of them was a crocodile. It might sound strange to us now. To modern ears, crocodiles are predators, creatures of danger and instinct, but for the ancient Egyptians, they were far more than that. They were power itself, raw, unrelenting, and divine, and in Calm Ombo, the crocodile god Sobek was not just respected, he was central to everything. When archaeologists first approached Calm Ombo, they noticed something unusual right away. The entire temple was symmetrical, perfectly mirrored down the middle. It wasn't built for one god, but for two. On one side stood Sobek, the crocodile-headed god of strength, fertility, and protection. On the other, Hroeris, the elder form of Horus, the falcon god, tied to kingship in the sky. This duality wasn't accidental, it reflected a deeper balance, one of power and order, of fear and wisdom, of water and sky, the very forces that Egypt relied on to survive. And yet Sobek's side always drew more attention. Even now, when you walk the ruined halls of Calm Ombo, you can feel the shift. On Sobek's side, the reliefs are bolder, the figures seem larger, more aggressive. You see carvings of crocodiles swimming among lotus flowers, soldiers kneeling, offerings being poured. The symbols of power are everywhere, and they feel closer to the surface, like something still watching. One chamber stands out among the rest, a small stone-lined room tucked away behind the outer columns, quiet, shadowed, and strangely cold. This was the altar chamber. It's here that the high priests of Sobek would perform the most sacred rituals. They would present food offerings, chant incantations, and at times, keep live crocodiles, raised in sacred pools, as living symbols of the god. When one of these creatures died, it was mummified with honor and buried in elaborate tombs, treated with the same respect as nobles. Archaeologists have discovered dozens of these crocodile mummies around Calm Ombo. some still perfectly preserved, their scales hardened by centuries of ritual and time. But why? Why worship such a creature? In the ancient worldview, it made sense. The Nile gave life, but it also brought danger. Crocodiles lurked in its waters, unpredictable and deadly. Sobek, as a crocodile god, became the embodiment of that power. By worshipping him, the people believed they could stay in balance with the river, protected, blessed, and strong. Sobek wasn't just a god of violence, he was also seen as a creator. In some myths, he was the one who brought the Nile into existence by rising from the primordial waters. Others claimed his sweat formed the very rivers of Egypt. He was fierce, yes, but also life-giving. In a land where survival was tied to the rhythm of the Nile, worshipping Sobek was an act of survival itself. But Kom-Ombo's mysteries don't end with crocodiles. Hidden within its walls, researchers found something else, a set of strange carvings that many believe to be depictions of ancient surgical tools. On one column, detailed images show instruments that resemble scalpels, forceps, and clamps. Could this be one of the earliest records of organized medicine? It's possible. Kom-Ombo, it turns out, wasn't just a temple, it was also a healing center. People came from far away to be cured here, to pray under the eyes of the gods, and be treated by priests who may have been early surgeons. The combination of Sobek's strength and Horus's healing made the temple a place of restoration, not just fear. But over time, Kom-Ombo began to fade. The rituals slowed, the priests vanished, the live crocodiles disappeared. The Nile changed its course slightly, and the surrounding city fell into silence. By the time modern archaeologists arrived, much of the temple had been damaged. Earthquakes had cracked its walls. Later builders had reused its stones. But still, the essence of Kom-Ombo remained. And perhaps the greatest mystery of all is how deeply it still feels alive. Stand near the altar and close your eyes, and you can almost hear it, the low hum of a river god, ancient and watchful, reminding you that even in stillness, power waits just below the surface. The seal that traveled time. Scarab amulets. There is something almost immortal about the scarab. It's small, palm-sized, shaped like a beetle, crafted from stone, faience, or sometimes precious gems. But these objects, known as scarab seals, carried weight far beyond their size. To most they appear as decorative relics, little ovals carved with hieroglyphs and tiny beetle backs. But to ancient Egyptians, they were powerful symbols, alive with magic, memory, and cosmic law. We've unearthed thousands of them. In tombs, temple ruins, even washed up by the Nile's bend, each one stamped with names, prayers, and invocations, kings, deities, sometimes cryptic messages that even today remain untranslated. But here's where the mystery deepens. Some scarabs appear in places and times where they don't belong. Archaeologists have discovered Egyptian scarab seals as far as the Greek islands, in Bronze Age Anatolia, even buried deep in Mesopotamian layers that predate the New Kingdom itself. One, found in modern-day Israel, bore the name of Thutmose III, but was unearthed in a context 200 years too early. Another, carved with the name of a minor official from the 12th dynasty, was found in a Scandinavian hoard, long before there was any known trade between those regions. How did these amulets travel such distances? And more puzzling, why were they treated with such reverence by foreign cultures who seemingly didn't worship the Egyptian gods? The scarab, you see, wasn't just an object, it was an identity. In life, Egyptians wore them around their necks, embedded them into rings, or pressed them into wet clay to seal letters and contracts. In death, they were placed over the heart, especially the heart scarab, which was meant to speak on behalf of the deceased during the final judgment. They believed that during the afterlife, the heart might testify against its owner, confessing sins and failures, but the scarab could intervene, silencing the heart with a divine formula carved into its underside. A spell from the Book of the Dead. Do not stand against me in the tribunal, it would say. Do not oppose me before the judges. But not all scarabs were made for death. Some marked diplomatic agreements. Others acted as propaganda, commissioned by pharaohs to distribute their titles across the empire. Amenhotep III famously created enormous commemorative scarabs, some as big as a man's hand, celebrating his lion hunts, building projects, and marriage to Queen Tiye. It was the social media of its time, except carved in stone, and meant to last forever. What's strange is how often these scarabs were passed between hands. From Egypt to Canaan, to Cyprus, to Syria, traders carried them, priests gifted them, and occasionally they show up in graves of completely unrelated cultures, buried with warriors, merchants, or children, with no known Egyptian ancestry. Some scholars suggest that the scarab's power transcended religion, that foreign peoples respected Egypt's sacred objects enough to integrate them into their own funerary traditions. Others believe the scarabs were diplomatic tools, tokens exchanged in alliances, treaties, or royal marriages. But there's another theory, a more eerie one. Some of these scarabs might have been fakes, replicas, created outside of Egypt, using Egyptian styles, but mismatched symbols, blended languages, non-existent names, scarabs that look correct but aren't. Why would anyone forge a sacred object? Maybe to tap into its power, maybe for trade, or perhaps to preserve a memory of a civilization that was already starting to fade. We tend to think of the ancient world as separate bubbles, Egypt here, Mesopotamia there, the Hittites, the Minoans, all living in parallel but distinct. But the scarab suggests otherwise. It hints at a shared fascination, a hunger to possess even a fragment of Egyptian magic. The beetle itself, Scarabaeus sacer, was a sacred creature. It rolled balls of dung across the sand, which the Egyptians saw as a metaphor for the sun god Ra pushing the sun across the sky. A divine cycle, rebirth, resurrection. So when they carved the beetle into stone and placed it over a heart, or passed it across borders, they weren't just sharing jewelry, they were sharing a cosmology, a belief system, a fragment of eternity. Even today, scarabs are found in antique markets, in forgotten drawers, museum basements. Many are misclassified, some are completely ignored, but each one carries a fingerprint of a person, a time, a belief. Some are inscribed with names long lost to history, others still bear the mark of famous rulers, but their meanings are debated, and maybe that's the most haunting part. Despite the thousands we've found, we still don't fully understand what they meant to the people who wore them. Were they protective charms? Were they proof of identity? Were they bribes for the afterlife? Or were they simply memories, etched in stone? What we do know is this: the scarab traveled far, across deserts, seas, empires, and somehow, against all odds, it survived. The statue that sat in judgment, Osiris' tribunal figure. They said it watched silently, never blinking, carved in perfect stillness, but with eyes that always felt awake. The statue wasn't hidden in some deep crypt or sealed tomb. It stood in full view, but no one truly understood what it meant. In the heart of ancient Abydos, Egypt's oldest cult center, archaeologists once uncovered a figure that didn't match anything in the known record. It was tall, narrow, and seated, not unlike a pharaoh, but without the symbols of royalty, no crook and flail, no inscriptions identifying the king. What it did have, however, was something far more unnerving: a scale, carved into the armrest, and beside it, a feather, the feather of Maudot. That single detail sent scholars scrambling through ancient texts. Maudot was not just truth, she was the concept of cosmic order, and in the Egyptian afterlife, the dead were judged by the weight of their heart against her feather. Too heavy, and they were devoured by Ammit, the soul eater. But this statue, it didn't just show Maudot's feather. It portrayed a tribunal, one that no records ever mentioned. The locals, even today, call it the Watcher, not just for how it looks, but because no bird lands on it, no dust settles on it. In the dry tomb air, every surface gathers powder except this one. When British explorers first catalogued it in the early 1900s, they assumed it was Osiris, god of the dead, but something was wrong. Osiris statues are common, and almost always follow the same rules: bound legs, arms crossed, the Atef crown. This one had none of those. The face was different, angular, almost stern, as though it was not meant to be prayed to, but to pass judgment. Some Egyptologists have gone back through the pyramid texts, the oldest religious texts on earth, to find parallels. There are whispers of a tribunal, a council of watchers that determined fate even before Osiris. Figures that existed in myth but were never named, only hinted at. And then, there's the strangest part. This statue was carved from greywacke, a hard volcanic stone. Not unusual in itself, except for one thing: no greywacke quarries have ever been found near Abydos. The nearest source is over 400 kilometers away, and this single statue weighs over 2 tons. It wasn't brought here by chance. Some say the tribunal figure was carried during a pilgrimage of purification, meant to absolve the sins of a dying dynasty. Others believe it was hidden for generations until it was needed again. In 2014, a CT scan revealed something even stranger. Inside the statue, embedded in its chest, was a hollow cavity. Empty now, but lined with metal, possibly once containing a scroll, or something else. But nothing was found. The cavity had been opened long ago. By who? The statue was untouched for at least 2,000 years, and there are no records of anyone opening it in modern times. That means someone in ancient history already knew it wasn't just a figure, it was a container, maybe even a vessel of memory. And here's the hook that keeps growing. Around the base of the statue are faint carvings, so eroded that only infrared scans can pick them up. They seem to depict scenes of weighing hearts. But in each one, the soul isn't being weighed by Osiris. It's being judged by the figure itself. Alone, no Thoth, no Anubis, no gods. just the watcher. And that turns everything we thought we knew on its head. What if this wasn't a statue of a god, but a representation of an ancient judicial force, one that predated the pantheon, a concept older than myth? In some corners of Egyptian esoterica, there are references to a lost age, when judgment was not about morality, but resonance, when the weight of a soul wasn't measured by good or bad deeds, but by vibrational harmony with the earth itself. This figure may be a surviving remnant of that forgotten system. There are even older myths, buried in apocryphal scrolls, that speak of the first tribunal, a circle of entities that pass judgment not on individuals, but on entire civilizations. And suddenly, the idea that the Osiris tribunal figure sat in judgment doesn't seem so symbolic anymore. Was it built to remind people of justice, or to serve as an actual link to a system long erased? And why is it still so clean? Why does no dust ever settle on it? Why do even the most skeptical researchers admit it feels like it's watching? Not haunting, not threatening, just aware. In the quiet hours of the dig site, some workers won't go near it. Others whisper stories of dreams, shared dreams about a stone room, filled with feathers and heartbeats. A great silence, broken only by the sound of weighing scales tipping ever so slightly. And always, seated in front of them, the same statue, staring, deciding. If you've ever felt that a place was watching you, not with eyes but with memory, you're not alone. This statue might be the proof. Before gods had faces, before heaven or hell had names, there may have only been one thing that mattered: balance. And maybe, just maybe, it's still being measured. If that made you wonder, subscribe, because the deeper we go, the stranger it gets. The amulet that marked resurrection. Ankh symbol talisman. In the silence of ancient tombs carved into the bedrock of forgotten valleys, one symbol appears over and over again, etched into stone, pressed into amulets, held tightly by mummies in their final moments. It's a simple loop over a cross, the ankh. To a modern eye, it might seem like a stylized key or a decorative pendant, but in the minds of ancient Egyptians, the ankh was life itself. More than life, it was eternity. Not just a symbol of living, but of resurrecting, of rising again, of never truly dying. And curiously, these ankh talismans weren't scattered at random. They were placed in very specific positions, held in the left hand, buried near the heart, or worn around the neck in exact alignment with the body's energy lines. Some scholars believe the placement mirrored spiritual paths unknown to us now. But why were these talismans so important that no burial was considered complete without one? The deeper you look, the stranger it gets. Across dynasties, across cities, across centuries, the ankh stayed the same. Gods held it out as a gift. Pharaohs clutched it on their deathbeds. It was carved into temples, carried in ritual processions, painted in tombs next to mysterious doorways. Almost like a guide, something to use after death, not just admire. The priests never explained its true meaning publicly. It was part of the temple secrets, passed on only through whispered chants in hidden chambers. But one recovered papyrus, known as the Scroll of the Returning Path, mentions a key that unlocks the horizon of the soul. The glyph shown beside it, the ankh. Archaeologists began to wonder, was this a symbolic gesture, or did the ancient Egyptians believe the ankh actually did something real? In 1903, a royal tomb was uncovered with the sarcophagus of an unnamed high priest. Alongside his body were 12 identical ankh talismans, each etched with a different version of the Eye of Horus. They weren't decorative. They were heavily worn, as if handled often, even ritually activated. What made this find even more baffling was that nearby were jars filled not with organs but with ashes and colored sand, red, black, and deep violet. Some researchers believe the priest was involved in resurrection rites, or perhaps an experiment that went far beyond simple belief. Some even suggested the ankh functioned like a spiritual device, meant to guide the soul through phases after death, like a cosmic passport. In one tomb painting, a figure is shown stepping into what looks like a portal, ankh in hand. Behind him is Osiris, not seated on a throne, but standing beside a tall frame of light, marked with stars and strange glyphs. No other Egyptian artwork depicts this scene, and it's not the only anomaly. In Saqqara, a series of underground tunnels was found beneath a forgotten necropolis. Inside were dozens of ankh amulets, but not made of gold or stone. These were cast in a strange metal alloy, one that didn't match anything native to the region. When examined, the talismans showed signs of magnetism, but only when held at a certain angle, like a compass responding to something deeper than Earth's magnetic field. And all of them were broken in the exact same place, the loop. Was someone trying to deactivate them, or ensure they were never used again? Even more disturbing, on the tunnel walls, inscriptions had been scrubbed away. But under infrared imaging, ghost traces revealed an unfamiliar ritual involving light, sound, and the cycle of the 9 gates. The Ankh appeared as the central symbol, hovering between realms, bridging body and shadow. In modern times, some have tried to replicate these artifacts, but the replicas never age, never tarnish, and never quite feel like the originals. It's as if the Ankh talismans weren't just sacred, they were activated once and never again. And yet some still report strange dreams after holding them. One researcher claimed that every night he slept beside an original Ankh artifact, he woke remembering vivid landscapes, none from Earth, wide gates of blue light, singing pillars, voices that spoke without sound. When he stopped, the dreams ended. Coincidence, or residue from an artifact that still echoes with ancient intention? In modern spirituality, the Ankh is a popular symbol, but in ancient Egypt, it wasn't just symbolic, it was precise, ritualistic, specific. It had a function, and that function was never publicly explained. Was it a map, a tool, a key to a gateway now lost? And if the ancient priests really believed it was the talisman of resurrection, did it work? Or was it a reminder that we are more than flesh, that something waits beyond the veil, and the Ankh is the last thing we hold before we pass through? Even now, no one knows exactly what the Ankh was meant to do, but in nearly every tomb, in nearly every burial, there it is, waiting, silent, still clutched in a hand that believed it would be used again. The tool that measured the stars, astronomical diadem. It looked like a crown, but no ruler would wear something like this casually. It wasn't built to impress people, it was meant to align with something far more constant, not kingdoms, but constellations. Archaeologists first dismissed it as ceremonial, a decorative headpiece buried alongside the bones of someone believed to be of royal blood. But one researcher noticed something odd. The tiny protrusions across the surface weren't random. They matched the position of stars, some visible only in the night sky, thousands of years ago. The so-called astronomical diadem was found in fragments deep inside a collapsed stone chamber in central Anatolia. Its metal wasn't gold or silver, but a rare alloy with magnetic properties. Along its curved frame were etchings that at first looked like meaningless dots and scratches. When cleaned and examined under angled light, the pattern emerged, a detailed sky chart. The question was, why would a Bronze Age culture need a wearable map of the heavens? Some believed it was a tool for navigation. Others proposed it tracked celestial events, eclipses, solstices, planetary alignments. But then came the strange part. The sky it mapped wasn't the one we see today. It was older, skies visible from this region over 10,000 years ago. That pushed the dating far beyond the accepted timeline. According to mainstream history, organized sky mapping didn't exist then. Cultures were still transitioning from nomadic life to farming. Yet this artifact suggested something very different. Someone, or some group, had a reason to map the stars long before civilization, as we define it, even began. Even stranger was the fit. The diadem wasn't just decorative, it matched the shape of an adult skull perfectly, and not just any skull, a narrow-headed specimen from the same site, showing signs of artificial cranial elongation. This practice, stretching the skull from infancy, was used in many ancient cultures, often to mimic the elite, or divine. Was the wearer of this diadem seen as more than human? The interior of the artifact was engraved with a pattern resembling orbital paths. Small grooves spiraled inward, some lined with powdered obsidian. A few of these tracks ended in dots carved from red jasper like planets frozen in motion. No writing, no symbols, just motion captured in metal. Astronomers brought in to examine the design noted that one sequence of stars etched along the brow line corresponded almost exactly with the Pleiades cluster, positioned as they appeared around 9500 BCE. If that was accurate, then the map wasn't decorative, it was data. Which raises a difficult question: how did this knowledge survive, and who passed it down? Most Bronze Age civilizations left myths of gods descending from the heavens, sky chariots, cosmic messengers, but stories like those are usually dismissed as metaphor. What if they weren't? In 1994, a fragment of the diadem was analyzed for isotopic composition. Something in the metal suggested exposure to radiation levels higher than what naturally occurs in that region. Theories began to surface. Unofficial, fringe ones, claiming the object may have been charged, possibly through atmospheric or geomagnetic means. Could it have served as more than a passive sky map? Local legend, passed down through shepherd tribes, spoke of a sky crown that marked the cycles of rebirth. The wearer was said to be able to predict when the rains would return, when the herds should move, and when the stars would gather close again. Was this ancient astronomy, or something closer to astrophysics? No written record names the civilization that made the diadem. The surrounding ruins had no scripts, just carved lines, serpents, spirals, and what looked like schematic flow. Not temple art, not war murals, just patterns, meant to be read, not worshipped. and one wall carving stood out. It depicted a figure standing beneath a sky full of stars, arms raised, and above their head, a floating band, almost identical in shape to the recovered diadem. Many believe this was a tool of power, not magical, but informational, a wearable archive of knowledge encoded through astronomy. In that era, knowing the stars meant knowing time, and if you controlled time, when to plant, when to migrate, when to predict disasters, you had power. Some researchers now believe the diadem was passed down between individuals, not by blood, but by initiation. You had to be taught how to read it. The grooves weren't just for aesthetics, they represented data pathways, ways of calculating or transferring meaning without written language. In 2019, an attempt was made to 3D scan the diadem fragments and digitally reconstruct its function. Using sky mapping software, a PhD candidate discovered that when aligned properly, the diadem's star map didn't just show constellations. It marked specific conjunctions, moments when stars and planets aligned in ways that affected Earth's electromagnetic field. It predicted them, but then the project stopped. No official reason. The scans were archived, but never published. Some claim funding was pulled. Others whisper that certain discoveries are better left hidden. After all, if someone had predictive knowledge of the skies 10,000 years ago, that would collapse everything we assume about human development. The crown is now locked in a temperature-controlled vault, inaccessible to the public. Its original fragments were never returned to Turkey. Some replicas exist in private museums, but none show the fine interior grooves. All that remains are questions. Why did a vanished people build a crown that matched the stars? Who was it for? And most haunting of all, was it ever meant for humans at all? The headdress that spoke for the gods, blue crown of war. They called it the Kapresh. Not a simple headdress, not mere ornamentation. It was royal, it was sacred, but it was also something else, something far older than official records admit. When people think of Egyptian crowns, they usually think of golden circlets or the striped nimis, but the blue crown was different, shaped like a bulbous helmet, dotted with golden discs, and painted in a deep indigo that wasn't just symbolic, it was deliberately chosen. Why blue? Why that material? And why did it only appear during wartime or divine rituals? Its origins were never fully explained in temple inscriptions. Even the priests avoided clear documentation. The first pharaohs to wear it didn't leave instructions behind. Instead, they left silence, deliberate silence, and that silence tells us something. Imagine the ruler of Egypt standing before thousands, adorned in a shimmering blue crown, not in celebration, not in mourning, but before battle. It was never called a crown in the beginning. It was something else entirely. Its earliest names translated more closely to mask or interface. Some scholars believe it wasn't made for humans at all. In the tombs of Karnak and Abydos, early murals depict beings wearing the same exact headpiece, beings taller than the surrounding humans with elongated limbs and glowing outlines. Were these divine metaphors, or were they something the Egyptians actually saw? Ancient scribes described the blue crown as capable of channeling command, not just giving orders, but amplifying them. A divine resonance. When the pharaoh wore it, he became the living voice of Horus, and no man could question him. Was this metaphor, or was there a function buried beneath the symbolism? One forgotten scroll, recovered during a lesser-known dig in the western desert, describes the crown in terms of sound shaping and signal focusing. It referenced golden points embedded into the surface. Some believe these could have been conductive nodules, others think they were symbolic stars. But if they were symbolic, why were they laid out in specific constellations? An astronomical mapping reveals something strange. The pattern of the golden discs on the blue crown matches the layout of Orion's belt and parts of Taurus. It wasn't random. Could it have been designed to align with celestial activity? If so, why? There are theories that the blue crown wasn't just worn to signal war, but to predict it. Some say it acted like a celestial receiver, absorbing energy, cosmic alignment, or even gravitational shifts. A few fringe researchers, digging into the electromagnetic properties of ancient dyes and resins, have gone so far as to suggest it could read or influence brain activity. It's a wild idea, but not unprecedented in certain forgotten texts. What's more troubling is that only a handful of physical blue crowns have ever been found, and none are intact. Most were shattered, missing the golden dots, or melted into slag. It's as if someone or something went through history to remove the originals. During Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, his scholars documented a blue crown found near Memphis. It was placed in a sealed stone chamber, unlike anything else they'd seen, but within a few days it was gone. No official record, only a passing mention in a journal entry. Others say it was taken to a private collection in Europe and never seen again. If that crown still exists, why is it being hidden? Let's go deeper. Some say that the blue crown wasn't Egyptian at all. Its design, the way it flared back at the nape of the neck, was remarkably similar to ceremonial helmets worn in Mesopotamia centuries before Egypt's dynastic rise. Some tablets from Sumer describe a skyborne helmet that whispers commands from the stars. Coincidence? In one particularly strange myth from the reign of Thutmose III, the blue crown is described as having whispers of fire and breath of thunder. It came alive when the pharaoh donned it before battle. Witnesses said his voice became distorted, like multiple beings were speaking at once. It wasn't just a crown, it was a statement, a transformation. Why would so many stories associate this one object with cosmic energy, divine authority, and military power? Could it be that what we're calling mythology is the only language they had to describe advanced tools? The blue crown doesn't fit the rest of Egypt's regalia. It has no clear predecessor, no logical evolutionary design. It just appears, fully formed, and disappears just as mysteriously. The last confirmed appearance of the blue crown was during the reign of Ramesses II. After that, nothing, not even on statues. It's as if someone scrubbed it from memory, but maybe that's because it served a purpose too powerful, or too dangerous for the future. And so it sits, not in a museum, but in whispers, hiding in the shadows of ancient walls, coded into the constellations, waiting for someone who can understand what it really was. The blue crown of war wasn't just worn by a king, it was worn by those who were never fully human,